Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this gray morning. I'm Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health here at the CUNY School of Public Health, and I'm also the director of the Urban Food Policy Institute here at CUNY. Just a couple questions. How many of you, before reading about this meeting, were familiar with the UN NCD high-level meetings? Raise your hand if you knew something about it before. So some of you. And how many of you have had any connection to the meeting that's happening at the UN tomorrow or some of the side meetings that go on? Again, a show of hands? Okay, some of you. So we hope that you'll become more familiar with the process over the course of this session and be another person who can monitor our progress. I want to start by setting the stage for today's session. 7 years ago, here in New York City, the first UN high-level meeting on non-communicable diseases, NCDs, it's the word that people in other parts of the world use for what we call in the US chronic diseases, met to discuss the growing health, social, and economic burdens NCDs were imposing on high, middle, and low-income countries around the world. A World Health Organization report prepared for the UN meeting concluded that 4 risk factors, tobacco use, unhealthy diets, alcohol use, and physical inactivity, accounted for the vast majority of the rising prevalence of premature deaths and preventable illnesses from conditions like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, stroke, hypertension, and some forms of cancer. Later, the UN and the WHO set the goal of reducing premature deaths, those before age 70, by 25% by 2025, a goal that has proved elusive. Here in the US and in New York City and around the world, NCDs are a leading cause of persistent inequalities in health between the better off and the poor, and in the US and New York City, between blacks and other people of color on the one hand, and whites. In seeking to achieve this reduction of 25% by 2025, the public health community has launched 3 different, although sometimes intersecting, strategies. The first seeks to change individual behavior through education, counseling, and support. These strategies encourage and support people to quit or not start smoking, eat healthier diets, stop or reduce alcohol consumption, and become more physically active. And this approach is an essential foundation for reducing NCDs, but by itself, it has shown disappointing results in bringing about population-level changes. The second strategy is to change the behavior and practices of the healthcare system to provide more people with access, emphasize clinical and community prevention, and ensure that every healthcare worker applies what we know about prevention and early intervention for NCDs. This, too, is an essential foundation for reducing the burden of NCDs. But as public health researchers deepen our understanding of what we call the social determinants of health and the challenge of transforming healthcare systems that have mostly focused on treatment rather than prevention, the limits of the strategy of changing healthcare to reduce NCDs have also been recognized. So 2 essential strategies, but each with limits. The third strategy, the focus of our session this morning, is on changing the behavior of the corporations that have played such a powerful role in promoting the behaviors that contribute to NCDs. This approach examines the business practices of food, alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical corporations, if we include air pollution, also the automobile and other industries, their marketing, product design, pricing, and retail practices to identify opportunities for prevention and for changing the practices of corporations that contribute to NCDs. It also puts the spotlight on corporations' political activities, such as lobbying, campaign contributions, sponsored science, and philanthropy, to illuminate their influence in either weakening or strengthening public health protection. And the hypothesis is, by limiting corporate political practices that undermine public health, we can prevent disease and also perhaps strengthen democracy. In our examination of this third strategy today, we're focusing on the food industry, but also looking for lessons from efforts to control the practices of the tobacco, alcohol, and other industries. We're hoping to be able to answer these questions, and we'll hear the presenters who I'll introduce in a moment, and then have some time for discussion. First, since the 2000 UN meeting, what progress have we made in changing corporate practices that contribute to NCDs? What have been the successes and what obstacles have been encountered? Where do we go from here so that if we meet 5 years from now, we can be clear that we've made progress in reducing NCDs? Second, as public health or nutrition professionals, policymakers, or advocates, what roles can we play in strengthening public policies that reduce health-damaging corporate practices and reinforce health-enhancing ones? How can those of us who teach better prepare our students to take on these roles? How can those of you who are students acquire the skills you need to contribute to corporate behavior change as well as individual and healthcare change? New York City, this is our third and final question, New York City has always been a cradle of public health innovation, including recently in the prevention and control of NCDs. What have we learned that might be of use to other nations and other cities? And equally important, in a city where NCDs account for more than 80% of the deaths and are the driving force between the city's glaring and persistent racial and economic inequalities in health, what can we learn from other cities and countries that will help reduce the burden of NCDs here? And I'm very pleased that our speakers will be able to talk about some of the efforts in other parts of the country. We'll hear first from Jeff Collin, who's a professor of global health policy at the University of Edinburgh and has written about corporations' health and commercial influences on health. And on the handout, there are more detailed biographies of our speakers. Our second speaker will be Paula Johns, who is here from Brazil, and she is the co-founder and director of the ACT Health Promotion, a Brazilian coalition of over 1,000 members that's been active on tobacco, food, and other public health issues. And our third and final speaker will be Nina Prasad, who joined the public health team at Bloomberg Philanthropies a few years ago, and she directs Bloomberg Philanthropies' Global Obesity Prevention Program, and we'll talk some about the lessons from that. And with that, I turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. It's a genuine pleasure to be here. We always say that, but I really mean it this time and not just because of the view. It's a real privilege to be here and a really exciting event that Nick and colleagues have put together. Again, a real pleasure to be sharing a platform with Paula and Nina. It's just a pity that this morning's session looks so much more interesting and worthwhile than anything that's going to happen down the road tomorrow. And that kind of frames some of my discussion today, because Nick asked me to speak about limiting corporate interference in health policy, lessons from across tobacco, alcohol, and food. I should say that I'm a political scientist by background. I've spent a lot of time working on the globalization of the tobacco industry and also on global efforts to regulate the tobacco industry, and then got interested in basically why aren't similar lessons being learned when it comes to alcohol or ultra-processed food, and that kind of provides the backdrop for what I'm talking about today. Basically, I think that this slide is my presentation. This slide is always my presentation wherever I speak. It's a quote from the economist J.K. Galbraith way back in the 1970s, who suggests that the institution that most changes our lives we least understand, or more correctly, seek most elaborately to misunderstand, that's the modern corporation. And I really want to focus in, from a public health perspective, on the seek most elaborately to misunderstand, because I do feel that when we look at the political declaration on NCDs that's been agreed this week, the really imaginative efforts to deliberately misunderstand the corporation and the range of actors involved here are really very striking. So I want to kind of frame my presentation of lessons from across tobacco, alcohol and food with reference to the draft political declaration that's going to be agreed. And to present the declaration as essentially being a triumph of optimism, or at least of ideology, over experience and certainly over evidence. This is going to be, it's a bit rat-a-tat-tat, very fast. I've got a short space of time, and there's a lot of things wrong with this declaration that I want to touch upon. But I want to kind of present these around interlinked commitments that are across the document on the importance attached to partnership with unhealthy commodity industries, among others, and to voluntarism. The really depressing level of emphasis on individual choice and individualism in public health interventions, and also to touch on the way in which tobacco is still presented as being rather different, and there's a reluctance to learn lessons that I think are really important and potentially very exciting in terms of promoting policy coherence across the regulation of unhealthy commodity industries. So if we start with partnership, now commitments to partnership are multiple across the document. I've just highlighted a few here: promotion of public-private partnerships to accelerate ambitious action, etc., 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 engage with the private sector. And this fits with the prominence of partnership within the Sustainable Development Goals agenda and the Global Health agenda more generally, so that at the World Health Assembly a few months ago, Dr. Tedros, in his opening speech, suggested that we have to believe in partnerships. That's the only way. There's a serious suggestion that the only way we can achieve global health goals is through partnership with the commercial sector. And this seems particularly odd in an NCD context where, analytically, it's very clear that these are primarily industrial epidemics, and that regulating unhealthy commodity industries has to be central to any serious efforts to reduce these. And it's leading to some pretty perverse consequences. Some of you may have followed the story about the really rather extraordinary partnership between the Global Fund Against AIDS, TB and Malaria and Heineken, which was eventually suspended after the efforts of a number of people and organizations. But this followed on from an earlier partnership between the Global Fund and SAB Miller. The very idea of a partnership between the Global Fund and the alcohol industry, given the extent to which alcohol is a risk factor for STD, seems kind of extraordinary. But then there's a whole host of other partnerships that the Global Fund are involved in, which are equally problematic from a global health perspective, but which don't really get questioned, like Coca-Cola, like Unilever. And of course, the industry puts an awful lot of effort into presenting partnership as the preferred and only model capable of achieving serious health goals. This is from some work we're just about completing, analysing submissions to an Australian Preventive Health Task Force a few years ago across the alcohol, food and tobacco industries. And all of them emphasise inclusivity, multi-stakeholder fora, as the key to success, as key enablers of health goals. And are putting some serious efforts and significant money into providing governments with helpful guides to how to construct partnerships to maximise effectiveness. And pretty much simultaneously, the alcohol industry is organising a meeting at the UN around a similar kind of theme. But the IARD, the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking, front group of the alcohol industry, is providing governments with helpful advice on how to build partnerships to reduce harmful use of alcohol. But in addition to whether or not partnerships are the right way, there's also something pretty disingenuous about positioning partnerships as the only way. Any of you recognise what this map is? Yeah, so these are the countries who have ratified the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. There's one or two fairly notable exceptions that would be impolite to highlight in current company, but this is the fastest, widest ratified treaty in UN history. And it also is built on something that's very clearly an alternative to the dominance of the partnership paradigm. Conflict of interest and managing conflict of interest is arguably the defining feature of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and indeed of tobacco control more generally. So at the heart of the FCDC is this little article that says, in setting and implementing their public health policies, parties shall act to protect these policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. And I'd argue that this is the most important intervention in tobacco control. We don't frame it as an intervention as such, but actually pretty much everything that happens in tobacco control policy and research stems from taking conflict of interest seriously. It underpins all areas of activity. Among these, for example, is the recognition that voluntary regulation is recognised as inadequate and inappropriate. Unfortunately, this is a lesson that our colleagues in the UN seem reluctant to recognise. And again, there's a very strong emphasis on voluntary approaches within the draft political declaration. So it invites the private sectors to strengthen their commitment and contribution, including encouraging economic operators in the area of alcohol production to contribute to reducing harmful use of alcohol in their core areas. Now, this just doesn't work. It's an absolute nonsense, and we know it's a nonsense. Some colleagues last week produced an incredibly extensive appraisal of CSR activities undertaken by the alcohol industry, developed an inventory of over 3,500 industry actions. I thought these colleagues had to be insane to undertake this task, but I'm very glad that they've done so. Only 1.9% of these CSR activities were supported by any evidence of effectiveness. 3/4 didn't conform to global strategy categories, that's global strategy to reduce alcohol, harmful use of alcohol, and only 0.1% of these 3,500 industry actions were consistent with best buys for prevention and control of non-communicable diseases. This seems unlikely to be a coincidence. Closely related to this, we've got a very strong emphasis within the document on personal choice and individualism, and I think the single most depressing and indeed appalling statement within the draft political declaration is that to empower the individual to make informed choices, strengthen health literacy through education, educating the public, reducing this all down to individuals to choice, using precisely the kind of framing that alcohol, food and tobacco companies have long been arguing, with the inevitable result that we end up focusing attention on ineffective education-centred interventions. When what we know is that if we think about regulating unhealthy commodity industries in innovative and imaginative ways, we can forget about the individual level nonsense and move upstream in really exciting ways to tackle the NCD burdens at national and international levels. I very briefly met a colleague looking at the impact of NAFTA on food here. One of the things that I think is really exciting about looking at regulating unhealthy commodity industries as a way of tackling upstream determinants of health is that it can allow us to identify routes to influence trade level negotiations in ways that we haven't been able to do in the past, but which is a level of ambition that's clearly necessary but sadly missing from the current draft. And finally, and I wouldn't want this to be misinterpreted. I'm very glad that there's an emphasis on the FCDC within the document. But again, there's this sense that tobacco is somehow different. That we've taken extraordinary measures to reduce the harmful impacts of tobacco, but that this is predicated on the tobacco industry being different. So that the political declaration recognises the need to prevent tobacco industry interference in policy, but positions that as somehow very different from the potential role and contributions of alcohol, food and soft drink companies. And this framing has been politically very important within tobacco control, key enabler of the FCDC process, But I'd like to suggest that maybe we need to think about it being past its sell-by date when we look at the scale of challenges confronting us internationally. It relies on tobacco products being seen as uniquely harmful consumer goods, and on presenting the tobacco industry as behaving exceptionally badly as a pariah industries. But it's increasingly clear that other industries have comparable impacts on population health, and there's clear evidence of both strategic similarities and collaboration across these industries. The evidence base on strategic similarities is growing very markedly. There's been a number of really interesting systematic reviews, for example. I'd also like us to at least think about whether it makes sense to see these as separate industries at all. This is a slightly impenetrable slide, but hopefully it's an interesting one. It's actually a kind of depiction of the merger between SAB Miller and AB InBev, the world's two biggest brewers, a couple of years ago. Third biggest merger in corporate history, and I think the biggest thing that's happened in global health this decade. And this move was driven by 3G Capital, a group of Brazilian venture capitalists who previously led the merger of Kraft and Heinz and bought out Burger King. The tobacco industry were prominent actors because of their stake in SAB Miller. So SAB Miller was about a quarter owned by Philip Morris, the makers of Marlboro, and they were very enthusiastic about the merger. And the chairman of SAB Miller was the former chairman of British American Tobacco, who'd been appointed precisely because of his expertise in penetrating emerging country markets. And one of the key impediments to the merger was the rival distribution deals that SAB Miller had with Coca-Cola and AB InBev had with Pepsi in Africa. And of course, Africa was the key to this merger. The entire rationale for this project was to increase the sales of beer in Africa. In this context, I think this is just a snapshot way of suggesting that we need to rethink the extent to which we conceive and look to regulate these companies as separate industries. Rather, we need, I think, to engage more creatively with those aspects of the SDG agenda that look rather more promising and exciting. So in Goal 3, for example, I'd suggest that strengthening the capacity of all countries, in particular developing countries, for management of national and global health risks. Clearly, this was intended to primarily with reference to infectious diseases, but it shouldn't be beyond us to position the global expansion of the alcohol industry or the global expansion of ultra-processed food and drinks industry as being global health risks that merit regulation. And crucially, I'd like to focus attention just in the last minute or so on enhancing policy coherence for sustainable development. This just means maximizing synergies across policy spheres. Firstly, I think we need to think about this in terms of demonstrating coherence with other actors. Again, a key enabler of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was getting the World Bank on board. We need to be able to make the economic case for the regulation of unhealthy commodity industries in similarly persuasive ways. But most importantly, I think we need to think about moving beyond the silos in which we in public health typically operate. One of the many ways in which Paula Johns is fabulous and exciting is the way in which ACT have moved from an organisation that focused on tobacco to an organisation that also addresses alcohol and food because of the recognising the common challenges and common opportunities there. And I think there are some major opportunities for innovation in health governance, for challenging partnership and the dominance of the partnership paradigm through a focus and an emphasis on managing conflict of interest, not out of being obstructive, but as being the key to effective health governance for NCDs. All sorts of ways in which we can think more imaginatively about tackling industrial vectors of disease. We can creatively engage with the SDG agenda. I think we can revitalise the Healthy Cities agenda. Bloomberg are doing some really interesting work here, but I think there are all sorts of ways in which we can think about what would regulating NCDs for healthy cities really look like if we took it seriously and comprehensively. We need to think about mutual threats, and we also need to think about those areas where there are elements of competition and tension across these issues, but to recognise that we've got to manage these rather more effectively than we've done so in the past. Out of time. Apologies, it was a bit of a rant, but very happy to discuss this afterwards. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Well, Nick has, that's okay. Is that okay? I always have a tendency to speak like that in the microphone. Is that okay? Okay. The sound is good? Yeah, great. Well, first, thank you, Nick, for arranging this event. I think I agree with Jeff. That's one of the exciting ones in the parallel agenda for the high-level meeting. As Nick introduced me, I'm from Brazil, and I'm going to introduce briefly my organization and talk a little bit about, I'm not going to talk specifically about the declaration. I think Jeff has done it, and there are several documents and letters and comments about it out there. So just like where we come from, we are an advocacy organization, and as Jeff mentioned, we started our work focusing on tobacco control, and we believe in the power of coalition building and having different areas involved. So I'm a social scientist myself, so I'm not from the health area, so I got completely involved in tobacco control, and I saw the social context behind tobacco control, not at all the individual behavior of a smoker or not a smoker. Really, honestly, from my personal perspective, it's not what I care about, whether the person smoke or don't smoke or eat this or that, but mostly about the social context behind those behaviors and what type of environments we are creating and what forces behind those environments. So we do advocacy and we train other organizations and we meet with them and we get inspiration. We go there and we direct, knock at the doors of politicians, and we start getting together as a group of organizations to ratify the FCDC in Brazil, which was a very difficult process. It was 2 years at the Senate because of industry pressure, the tobacco industry pressure through front groups. So that was a very exciting movement, and that really helped us to become together as a group. We believe, and we connect with the global health agenda, we started in tobacco because of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and now more lately, since 2011, broadening the scope to deal with the other risk factors for NCDs and always in the coalition building. FCDC, how many people here know about the FCDC? Can I get a, okay? So it's the first, Jeff has introduced it, it's the first global health treaty, and it's very powerful, and it has really helped to build momentum for getting really effective policies around tobacco control. Before the FCDC, I think a lot of the conversation was about educating school children about it so that they won't become smokers when they grow up, in a scenario in which you have marketing everywhere, you have all sorts of environmental pressures to make people smoke. So it's really an unfair competition when you have such a environment that does exactly the opposite of what you're preaching inside the schools for school children. And we see a little bit happening there now with the other areas when you think about healthy eatings and so on. We are not talking really about, okay, how we're going to do about the marketing of all this ultra-processed junk food that it's all over the places and everywhere, and that's the way to go, and not about individual choice or parents' fault. We hear a lot, in Brazil, the framing around it, it's the parents' responsibility. They need to take care of that. In an environment where the kid is overloaded with the worst possible products with their favorite cartoons. So it's just it's a total unfair competition. It's very similar to what happened to tobacco. So the FCDC was really good in showing and bringing evidence that there are simple population-wide interventions that really work, and that's what we need to go for when you talk about food policy. And the same 4 areas that we had for tobacco, ad bans, smoke-free space, we are talking about institutional environments, be it schools or universities or hospitals or other institutional environments, warning labels, and taxation, which we are getting a lot of pressure against the most effective ones everywhere, and I'll show a couple of examples from Brazil, what's going on there. So it also helped to build momentum for action. If I have to think about the global declaration and the weakness of the document itself, I think the good side, the good news about the movement around NCDs, the global movement around NCDs, is that it does help to create some momentum. And one of the best ways to realize that you can't really partner with those industries when you try to implement a policy. Then you really get it, oh my God. I've heard when I think about back in 2011, and many people, it's you get this mantra, public-private partnerships. We're not going to do it alone. Partnerships, multi-stakeholder. We are all together in the same boat. It's just like, okay, we repeat it many times so you went out believing it. I think that's probably the strategy. But the upside of it, when you're trying to implement the policy, even people that I heard back in 2011 promoting this partnership mantra, that once they try to implement a policy at national level, oh my God, it doesn't really work. I mean, they will not let us implement this very effective policy. They will claim that there's no evidence. So there is a lot going on there. So I think that one of the major important things, and Jeff has already introduced, is the recognition that conflict of interest is an important issue. We need to deal with that, and we need to expose it, and we need to talk about it and discuss how can we protect public health policies from undue interference from the commercial sectors that profit from it. So advocacy, I think we did it in Brazil in terms of smoke-free legislation. I think it happened all over the world. How many people heard that it will be impossible to become smoke-free? I heard it more than 1,000 times as an advocate at national level, but we did it. We started by having a state law in São Paulo. It was not easy. We heard so many times it will be impossible to get bars and restaurants smoke-free, and we did also get a national law, so it is possible. It's stuck here. Okay, I use the other one. So I think Brazil has a very successful story in tobacco control. We had the largest reduction over the last 25 years, and that's because of these policies in these mainly in these 4 areas. Now, jumping into obesity, I have less than 10 minutes left. I used too much time with the other one there. The prevalence of obesity, we have a problem. I mean, we can agree that we definitely have a problem around obesity. That's a major issue, and I'm really scared when I look at these trends of like Brazil, it's really going high up very quickly, and like US and Mexico, it's a nightmare. So there is some links for some evidence. One, I think I want to make some propaganda. I should put some other more reference there. The Brazilian food-based dietary guidelines, they are wonderful. They talk about all those things. They talk about the food environment. They talk about eating together. They talk about sustainable agriculture. They talk about the entire food system in a very simple way where you say, eat real food. Stop with like this fancy, trendy, quinoa, whatever, healthy, blah, blah, blah. Eat food. Eat real food in a culture. I mean, go back to like cultural eating, like regional foods and local foods, and we just need to eat food. Simple as that. Not about these nutrients and vitamins. I mean, it goes beyond this paradigm of thinking like nutrition-based guidelines. There is iron here and there is this, that. Forget it. If you have a very diversified diet, you will be fine. We are talking, at the end of the day, what we're all talking about, it's about there is a huge unbalance of power in the power relation, and that's what's shaping our policies, if you summarize it. And then I would like to talk about a very big problem we have in the food systems we have today. The concentration is not getting any better. It's getting worse. It's increasing from the seeds to the agrochemicals, to the farm machinery, to the animal pharmaceuticals. It's all getting more and more concentrated, and that will not help us at all to get a more sustainable food system. And I don't think there is a way to go about food policy without thinking about what system, how our food is being produced. And then like some examples of concentration, this is probably very outdated. It's not getting any better. We think that we have so many choices. I get really confused when I enter a supermarket here because there are thousands of brands of the same thing or different brands, and they're all just as bad, right? And you can't like find anything that I get really like, oh my God, I can't buy anything here because I can't choose because there are too many options. And at the end of the day, there are no options because they're all controlled by the same corporations. So I think we have a problem collectively as a society that the way we are going and the solutions that we are discussing about it are not really the solutions that will deal with the issue. Yesterday I heard a funny thing. It was about because we think too much about the individual behavior, we do not think about the policies that will deal with the systemic problems that we have. how do we do to change the games, the rules of the game in which we make those guys pay for their externalities? It's as simple as that. If the price would include all that it costs in terms of health and environmental harm, it will be a different price to buy a bad product, and it will be cheaper to buy a healthy product. And that's now not how it is today. And then I heard yesterday, not going to say where, but I heard a funny thing that, wow, it's all about like you need to, as an investor, you need to look where you're investing your money. Again, it's about the individual, like looking where they're going to invest instead of changing the more like the broader rule of how things are, because as it is today, it pays off to produce a harmful product and put it in the market. That's the reality of it. Inequalities, I think we know that's getting worse. I think Nick already mentioned it. The inequalities are not getting any better. Well, that was interesting. So in Brazil, I'll bring in the case of Brazil. 5 of the richest men in Brazil, they have the same wealth as 50% of the population. This is outrageous. And 3 out of 5 of these guys are the guys from the beer industry. Yeah, so it's, and it's what I'm going to quickly tell a case about Coca-Cola in Brazil, because that's, I think, I found that cartoon yesterday. I think it's brilliant, because it's always all about like less government, fewer regulations, free markets. I think from what I've seen, the free market is a big lie that we are told again and again, and there is no free market nowhere in the world. There are no such a thing as free markets. The type of incentives that they get by lobbying and shaping the policies, it's so huge. So there's no such a thing, and that's exactly what you see when it comes to what policies are being approved and what regulations are being approved or not approved. So we have an issue in Brazil, which we figured out not long ago, perhaps a year ago, that we subsidize Coca-Cola production in Brazil. It's just like, because they put the factories in the tax-free zone in the Amazon region, which was set up more than 50 years ago to help develop that regional development and so on. And they get all sorts of incentives, fiscal incentives and credits. And at the end of the day, whether you drink Coke or not, you are paying some money for them to profit more. So that's a big scandal, right? We can't even get space in the mainstream media to talk about it. We finally got an opportunity now because of some political issues there. And then Coca-Cola, and then the government issued a decree to stop with the subsidies. And then they threatened, that's okay, I'm sorry, this is in Portuguese, but then they threatened to leave Brazil. And it's just like, and then there was a cartoon saying, oh, if I don't, and it's the same people that normally criticize like social programs and incentives for like free schools or whatever, a minimum wage for people, whether you work or not. It's the same people criticizing it. They are the ones that are supporting this type of subsidies, big subsidies, where the problem comes from really. So that's the second one. And then there was what's like Coca-Cola saying, well, without that sponsorship, I'm going to leave Brazil. So they threatened it publicly. So there was a news story about it. And this is a cartoon. Okay, we discovered the secret formula of Coca-Cola. It's because they do not pay billions in taxes every year. So that's a huge scandal. And the story is in the link that I provide to you. That's one of the stories that is in English and shows all the links between the policymakers and the people that made the decisions around this particular subsidy. I won't have time to talk about it, but I think we can talk about it in the debate. I took a government course in governmental relations to see how my adversaries were being trained. By the way, I'm not going to point fingers to anyone, but if there is anybody from like that work for an industry funded association or for the industry, we'll mostly welcome. I think we need to have a discussion, because I truly believe that at the end of the day, we are in the same boat. And I know there is a lot of like justification around, oh, we're going to try to be a part of the solution from inside and change blah, 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 blah. But let's then really do something about changing the rules of the game, or else we're not going to go anywhere. So that's one of the slides in the course that I had. So it's all about avoiding regulation and taxation. I can sum it up with these two things, that what the lobbyists learn in this course. These are some of the key messages. That's why they want to have connections with NGOs, because they have more credibility. That's why you don't see the company just going out there fighting against the policy. They have front groups, they have associations, right? And they have NGOs, and focus on your interests and not on your principles. I heard that. I was just like, teacher, are you really saying that? I mean, are we going to discuss ethics here? And there's so much brainwashing in terms of finding the justification. Oh, that's how things are, and so on. And I think we all can play a role in terms of changing that. This slide, it's a wonderful one, but I think Nina will show it. So I'll leave it there because there's no more time. I think that's the solution, right? Just like not bullet points, and that's where we need to go. And that's the link that you have in the flyer. And just a final sentence, as long as it is more profitable to sell unhealthy foods, it will be really difficult to overcome our challenge in the area of food and nutrition. And that's how it is today. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Nick, for the invitation. I think this is such an important and timely topic, and one that's very near and dear to us at Bloomberg Philanthropies. So I want to thank Paula and Nick, because I hope my presentation will be a continuum of the really great foundation that they've laid. I'm basically going to talk to you about how Bloomberg Philanthropies has approached the problem of obesity and why we've taken the approach that we've taken, and also share some of the strategies that have been effective in bringing about regulatory change. And I'm going to whip through it because I would like to make sure we have lots of time for discussion. So basically, our approach is to support civil society organizations and academics in low and middle income countries to identify, implement, and evaluate effective obesity prevention policies. And we choose partners that are active in the space, that have a track record for advocacy, know what it's like to take on powerful industries and powerful interests. You can see here where we work. So we have two prongs to our program. The first is what I would call our focus country component, where we have deep investments in the 6 countries listed here. And there we support both policy and advocacy and evaluation once policies are in place. And then we also have what we call an evaluation fund. So we recognize that countries all over the world are going to put in place important policies, promising policies, and we're in need of as much evidence as we can get. And so it's really important to evaluate wherever those policies are taking place. But often there aren't resources for evaluation. So we felt really strongly that we should be supporting that. So at the moment, we are supporting some work in Chile as well as in US cities around sugary beverage taxes. This is an overview of how we are approaching this problem. I think in a nutshell, we believe that this requires regulatory action. And this is very much modeled on our tobacco control program. For those that don't know very much about us, our signature program in public health is reducing tobacco use around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries. And as we've heard, there's a lot of parallels between tobacco and obesity prevention, so we definitely draw on our experience in tobacco. Our goal is ultimately to improve the food environment so that healthier options are the default. I know that the focus of this discussion is influencing corporate behavior, that's really not our primary focus. I think we recognize that it needs to happen as a side effect of regulatory change, but our goal is to create a healthy food environment. And the policies that we've prioritized are listed here in the middle. And this was developed in consultation with leading nutrition experts from around the world, and really is based on best available evidence. So the 4 policies in our package are fiscal measures, marketing restrictions, warning labels, and healthier schools. This is not at all to imply that if we put in place these 4 policies, we will have fixed the problem. No. We at Bloomberg feel that our comparative advantage is in demand reduction, and again, that really follows from our experience in tobacco control. So this is where we've chosen to concentrate, but we recognize that much more needs to happen, and ideally it happens together, and we get moving on this quickly. The way we do that is so we support civil society and researchers in our priority countries to do advocacy, mass media, research for policy, and then once policies are in place, we support rigorous evaluation of those policies. So Paula briefly put this up, and I don't know, have people seen this before? Yeah, some people, maybe not. So basically, this came out of some email leaks during the 2016 U.S. presidential election, which we probably don't want to revisit in much detail, but this was really interesting. It was basically a communication between Coke executives, and what they've done here is they've mapped out various policies. And so on the x-axis, you have the feasibility. Is this policy likely to materialize? And then on the y-axis, you have the business impact. So, and behind these, you can see in kind of faded writing is their strategy. So if something is on the upper right-hand quadrant, which in this case is taxes, their strategy is to fight back because they've assessed that it's likely to materialize and it's going to have big business impact. The only reason that I'm showing this is because their policy, what they feel is going to have impact and is feasible, is very similar to what we have also determined. So it was nice to have that validation, probably one of the few times where we agree. And I've circled what we're working on, and I think, they're all relatively high business impact. I just would like to take a minute or two to make the case for why we feel regulatory action is needed. So, and I'm going to show you a few examples, and I hope they speak for themselves. So this is a very recent report by an entity called Keybridge, which just about a month ago assessed the impact of the American Beverage Association's 2025 Beverage Calorie Initiative. It's a voluntary program, and the goal is by 2025 to have a 40 calorie reduction in liquid beverage calories. And this is compared to 2014. And they just put out their report, which goes through the end of 2017, and we've seen a 2 calorie reduction. So there's a way to go there. And I want to contrast this, and I will admit that these aren't perfect comparisons. They're not apples to apples comparisons, but the point I'm trying to make is the rate of progress when you've got a regulatory action versus a voluntary action. So in 2016, the government of Chile put in place a really innovative, exciting front of package labeling regulation, which basically requires labels on foods that exceed certain levels of saturated fat, sugar, and sodium. So if you use the example of Fanta on the very left, that's what Fanta looked like back in 2015. You can see the calorie and sugar composition there. Then the warning label regulation came into effect in June 2016, and by June 2017, original Fanta had reformulated. It was a new product with less than half the calories, far less than half the sugar. So I just want to point out that this happened really quickly, you know, and you contrast that with the 2-calorie reduction over 3 or 4 years that I just showed you. And then one final quick example, this comes from the UK, and in the UK they've got both voluntary and regulatory measures happening simultaneously. And Public Health England in May released a report of the impact of some of these measures. So the first is they looked at the impact of UK's sugary drinks tax, which came into effect in April 2017. And the industry had 2 years notice. So the government announced it in 2015. The tax is structured based on the amount of sugar. So there's 3 tiers, and if you're less than a certain amount of sugar, you're not taxed. If you're kind of sugary, you're taxed at a lower level, and if you have a lot of sugar, you're taxed at a high level. So basically, given that structure and the 2 years they had to implement, it was meant to provide incentive to industry to reformulate, and reformulate they did. So Public Health England found that sales-weighted average sugar levels per 100 ml fell by 11% in those 2 years. Contrast that with a voluntary challenge to the industry to reduce sugar levels. I think the target is 20% by 2020, with the first year target being 5%, and we reached only 2%. So though the tax, the first one, you know, I mean, you can argue that the industry voluntarily reformulated, but I think we can all feel pretty confident that there was a nudge. The tax provided that regulatory environment, and they wanted to avoid, you know, having to raise the price of their products. So they were able to move a lot of their beverages into the low or no tax categories. And again, these aren't perfect comparisons. I think my point is this is urgent. We need to act now, and we've got to go with the best available evidence. Really quickly, because I've got 5 minutes left, I want to talk about some of the pilot work that we did in Mexico. And we work through local organizations everywhere we work. Our partner organizations determine the agenda, how they're going to do it, and you know, they're really driving. We provide support and facilitate where we can, recognizing that we need to level the playing field because there's powerful opposition. So I want to tell you a little bit about how Mexico, the advocates and researchers there brought about their sugary drink tax in 2013. So the first, and this is really, I think it's a common thread through everything we do at Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is solid data. So everything they did was through public health lens. This is a public health issue. We have the data to back it up. I'm not going to read out what's here. You can see it, but this was all of this data was done by very credible institutes, the Mexican National Institute of Public Health, and so on. They put a lot of effort into informing the public, so developed evidence-based mass media campaigns. And I think one thing that's true in all of the work that we do is you've got to bring the public along with you. You can't have this top-down approach where you're just going to ram through policies without getting public support. And in fact, we've found in all of the places where we work, if you take the time to inform the public why you're doing what you're doing, they'll usually support what you're doing. And in fact, in Mexico, we certainly saw shifts in people's understanding of the unique harms of sugary drinks and their understanding around the need for regulation after sustained campaigns. I want to, if I can get this to work, I'm going to show you this ad. This was an ad the partners in Mexico developed. It's adapted from an ad in New York City, so some of you may have seen this. It's called Don't Harm Yourself Drinking Sugary Drinks. It's in Spanish, but I think it's very evident what it's about.
¿Esto te suena familiar? Tomas un néctar por la mañana, un té helado a mediodía, un refresco con la comida, y un par más en la noche. Parece bastante inofensivo. Pero todas estas bebidas azucaradas en un solo día suman mucha azúcar adicional que puede provocarte graves problemas de salud, incluyendo la obesidad, que causa diabetes, enfermedades del corazón y algunos tipos de cáncer. No te hagas daño tomando bebidas azucaradas. Mejor toma agua con gas, leche baja en grasa o té sin azúcar. Cuida tu vida, tómala en serio.
So this kind of messaging works, and we do rigorous pre and post testing that validates that. And I think at Bloomberg, a lot of our investment goes into public awareness campaigns. The other thing that was very effective in Mexico was public actions to keep this issue in the news. So this was one brilliant example of what partners in Mexico did around Day of the Dead, which is a very significant moment in Mexico, where they basically commemorated the 500,000 deaths from diabetes in the previous administration. And and I think they generated thousands of news stories. It was really brilliant to observe. And in doing so, created a sense of urgency. This was very topical, and policymakers seemed to feel the need to act quickly. Coalition building is key. We support this everywhere we work, in tobacco, in obesity prevention. No one organization can do this alone. And so you've got to find common ground with other credible organizations. And this is just a snapshot of the Mexican Coalition, Nutritional Health Alliance, that was formed in 2012. And they came together at that time around the sugary beverage tax campaign. And, you've got Greenpeace in there, you've got child rights groups, you've got consumer rights groups, and so on. And they were able to find that common agenda. So in October 2013, Mexico's Congress passed a sugary beverage tax that took effect in January 2014. We and others have been supporting really well done evaluation of those policies, and you can see some of that here. There's also some Berkeley papers that are cited here. Berkeley in the US has a sugary beverage tax, and those two taxes have been around the longest, so there's the most evidence. And I just want to take this moment to say unequivocally that the early evidence is that sugary beverage taxes are working. They are reducing consumption. People seem to be making healthier substitutions to water. So I just really want to put that issue to rest, because there seems to be a lot of misinformation. And we're not talking about, is this going to reduce obesity tomorrow or heart disease tomorrow? No, that's going to take a long time. We know enough about the causal pathway between obesity and consumption patterns to say that if people are reducing sugary beverage intake and switching to water, it's going to have some impact. And we're really pleased that sugary beverage taxes since 2014 have really caught on. We count 22 countries and 9 subnational jurisdictions that have put in place sugary beverage taxes, and we believe that we're reaching a tipping point, and this will soon be considered public health best practice. And then finally, I think we need to, as we think about changing corporate practices, I think we also need to talk about the stuff that our partners experience that is just beyond normal rules of engagement. So, and we are finding, as we've been doing this work since 2012, that there are many parallels with how the food and beverage industry and the tobacco industries behave. And I've listed here some of the types of interference that we've seen. And I won't get into it. Perhaps we can talk more about it at the discussion, but it's strikingly similar to tobacco. And we have examples for each one of these, which I'd be happy to talk more about. So thank you so much for listening.
So thank you, the three of you. Really rich, dense, unprocessed discussion, and I think it's exactly the topics we need to be talking about in public health. Both here in New York City and globally. The format we're going to use is we'll take 3 or 4 questions. We ask you to identify yourself and, to the extent possible, keep your question or comment short. And after we've heard 3 or 4, we'll ask each of the panelists to speak to those questions which they want to respond to. So I see a hand up on that side, on this side, in the front there.
Good morning, and thank you so much for a really wonderful set of presentations. My name is Nevin Cohen, and I'm on the faculty here at the School of Public Health. And one thing I take away from all of your comments is the need maybe to focus on the upstream determinants of corporate power. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more. Something like overturning in the U.S. of the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court that gave corporations the right, as a First Amendment right, to contribute to campaigns. Do we need to focus there instead of on regulation?
Next.
Hi, my name is Colleen Shelley. I am a recent MPH graduate. And my question is about a lot of NCD policies are kind of centered around major cities, or they're implemented in cities. But I'm from a small town in the Midwest, and we often forget about like what we call Middle America. And I realize we're in New York City right now, but my question is, how can we be smarter about making policies that like Middle America might embrace, as opposed to like, the one example I might have is my mom is a teacher at a school like out in the middle of nowhere, and the kids even talk about at lunch how they hated Michelle Obama like for trying to make their lunches healthier, and it's just like gross and disgusting. So I guess that's the one example that I have for that.
We'll take 2 more, and then we'll have responses, and then we'll take another series.
Hi, I'm Bill Jeffrey. I'm with the Center for Health Science and Law in Canada, and was the author of one of the joint statements that's circulating about conflicts of interest at the UN meeting. So I just wanted to make an observation about one of Jeff's slides, and then I guess make another observation that I hope the panel can respond to. The chart you showed, Jeff, of all the green countries that had implemented, or that had endorsed the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, isn't really indicative of what's happening on the ground. I think the World Health Organization said something like 5% of countries had fully implemented it. So arguably, that's a chart that illustrates the biggest braggers in the world, you know. And you could see a similar kind of chart for the International Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitutes. Almost every country has endorsed it. A few have implemented it, and 6% are monitoring to make sure that it's implemented. But the point that I wanted to make generally about this conflict of interest thing is I worry that NGOs are participating in a lot of self-delusion about this. I mean, this session is called Time to Deliver, presumably named after the report of the WHO High-Level Commission on NCDs, which has 6 members that have conflicts of interest. They had some connection with mostly with the food and pharmaceutical industries, yet nobody is really saying that. The World Health Organization certainly isn't saying it. I'm sorry, I arrived a few minutes late. Maybe you, Nick did before I arrived. But if we're not honest about these kinds of things, then how can we expect governments to be candid about it?
And one more.
Hi, Alicia Goodman. I used to do a lot of work on genetic engineering in Hawaii years ago, and I'm curious now where things are at with country-level regulation when that gets implemented, and international trade disputes, and the challenge that goes on between that, and if it's getting overturned these days, or if countries are actually allowed to regulate and that holds up. Because I know sometimes it goes to the trade dispute, and then it gets shot down, and then the regulation has to be overturned. I'm just wondering where that's at now, if you can give some specific examples of not genetic engineering specifically, but any country-level regulation that's working.
A wide range of questions to get us started. And if I can ask the panelists to be on the brief side so that we can do at least a couple more rounds of this. And who wants to start?
I can start. So on the question about the upstream determinants of corporate power and where should we really be putting our energy, I think you're probably going to find this answer unsatisfying, but I think we need to put it in all of those places. And I think the way you do that is through alliances. And in fact, we've had a lot of these discussions in the places where we've worked where there may be an election coming up, a presidential election, and in that context, the food stuff that we're working on just feels like it's not going to get any airtime. And we've had lots of discussion about doing outreach to organizations and really banding with them who are talking more about these bigger, broader democracy, issues. So that's my sense. I think Paula and Jeff may have additional thoughts on that. And as I said, when I put up the coalition slide, no one organization can do this alone. I think you have to recognize your comparative advantages and then recognize what you can't do and seek those that can do it. And but couldn't agree with you more. On the issue of cities and middle America, so we work largely at the national level, though Bloomberg does a lot of programming at the city level and other programs, and certainly Mike Bloomberg, our founder, I think has shown the power of cities in making change. I recognize you're talking about more rural cities. There are examples of rural cities that are moving the needle on these issues. I think if you've got active communities, active students in high schools, I think you've got great vehicles potentially for change. The idea is maybe how do we make connections to people who can advise, who have a track record for success, so something for us to think about. And then on the trade disputes, so certainly we've seen this on tobacco. There have been lots of challenges. Most famously, the government of Uruguay was challenged on measures they were taking to increase graphic warnings and limit the use of colors and et cetera. And that suit was brought by Philip Morris through trade mechanisms, and essentially they lost. And I don't think we have any examples of a successful trade dispute in restricting tobacco control policy adoption. The thing is, though, it's intimidating, and which is exactly what it's meant to do. It's meant to intimidate small countries. They have limited resources. Philip Morris has the best lawyers, so that's where it could have some chilling effect. We actually at Bloomberg have a legal defense fund exactly for that reason. So if countries are challenged, we want to be able to support governments to defend themselves. And we are starting to see the use of trade disputes more in the food space. NAFTA is very topical, and there is a colleague here who wrote that book, and perhaps she wants to comment on NAFTA and the influence of diets in Mexico. And there was a story in the New York Times about an annex that was in the draft NAFTA agreement. This was around March or April. You may want to look it up, which basically was put forth by the U.S. and essentially would restrict countries from doing evidence-based front-of-package labeling. So it's a newer space with food. We have a little bit more to draw on from tobacco, and so far the tobacco story has been good outcomes at least. It's a lengthy process, and I think we just have to anticipate and prepare in the food space as best as we can. But it's so much newer, and we have to just do what we can with what we have available.
Yeah, I didn't write everything down while you were asking, so I hope I can answer some of the issues that were raised. I think in terms of, I think implementation, it's also a challenge. I think one thing, it's like to have the policy, and even if you have the best policy, it's really a challenge to implement. In terms, of smaller cities, or, I think there is, we haven't spoken so much about it, but I think there is a lot of potential for local movements and local organizations, particularly in the area of food, because differently than tobacco, for food you do have like local solutions which are possible, like CSAs and other initiatives that you can boost at local level. And tobacco, it's much more like just say no and just like regulate and just say no when we don't want it. So I see a lot more potential for mobilizing people around food than in other issues. And of course, it's a challenge. The reason why kids hate Michelle Obama, of course, it's an effect of marketing. Let's be honest about it, right? And it's the U.S., I think it's the worst place in the world in terms of the inability to regulate corporate power. It's a completely, like, it's a democracy that's completely taken over by corporate power. So I think it's a challenge that this country have, and actually it impacts many other countries. I think we are all like subject to it one level or another, but that's the collective challenge that we have. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about this converse. I mean, I don't think we have had conversations about it, and I think we should have conversations about it as understanding what are we fighting against, what is feasible in what area. One of the things that it's very clear from my perspective as an advocate, the reason why we're able to move with tobacco was that because we were able to single out tobacco. I mean, in the world that is as it is today, I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able just to shut off all the corporations in the world at the same time, simultaneously, and just say like everything, it's a huge conflict of interest, and just like we need to move to another planet or we need to shut it down completely as it is now. So I think there is some level of constructiveness and pragmatism that we need to have in the different fields, what we are fighting for in that particular one, what we are struggling against, and how much and how far. I mean, and for me, it's so clear with tobacco. Even when I took that course that I mentioned to you before, there are lots of foundations from several different areas, and I would talk with them in the oh yeah, no, but tobacco is different, yes. So it's just like you could talk about certain regulations for tobacco because you were talking about tobacco. And for me, the same is true when we are talking about food policy. I want to focus on like food policy issues and who are like my adversaries in food policy issues versus I have loads of like good relationships in the organizations in Brazil that work with access to medicines. Of course, they have nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry and are really loud about it and so on, so on, so. But it's a very particular setting. It doesn't mean that we are not working constructively together. Even in our Healthy Foods Alliance that we have specific for food issues, we have organizations who are allies to our alliance that do have dialogues, even with Coca-Cola, but they are not members of the alliance, but they do have dialogue with Coca-Cola. So I think there is some level of pragmatism when you are trying to push for a particular policy. And if we, because our challenge is so huge with this corporate power all over the place, I think we need to build really strategic alliances on how we are going to tackle the different issues and how much we can achieve. Because I think it was a good thing what we have achieved with tobacco. But it's also we are also somehow paying the price because the other corporations have learned how to avoid it happening to them. And it's because of that momentum that we are able to have like the Dr. Tedros that talks about partnerships all the time. That's just like withdrawing from an event because the tobacco industry is there. I think we're going to build in different areas, in different spaces, different things. And I think we are trying to have a constructive dialogue with you, Bill, and I think we need to do that at some point because I don't think we have managed even to talk about it. It's just a full-fledged attack without being able to talk about it. Let's talk about it, what's the strategy behind, because I don't think we are going to get, I don't think we want different things for the world. I think we want the same, and I think we want social justice, and I think we definitely have different views on how to get there, and we need to be very strategic on how we build alliances about it, and we need, as civil society organizations, we need to support ourselves in the different roles that each organization can play according to where they are or where they are not and what decisions they make and how they deal with conflict of interest. I think we need to be transparent and deal with that. And that doesn't mean saying that just like we say no to any corporation in any situation forever, and that's it. I think we have more nuanced relationship with that, and it in different settings how you deal with that. I'm sorry because you asked straight that question. I know there is this letter. We'll talk about it later because you tried to talk and you didn't want, so we'll talk about it later. Just like let's just exposing it here because I know this thing has been going on. And let's put it on the table, on the spot.
Thanks. I'm a small town boy, so I'll start with the small town stuff as well. And I mean, I agree that there's a challenge there, but I guess I do think that we consistently underestimate the power of public health in these contexts. You know, when I was cutting my teeth in tobacco control 20 years or so ago, campaigns were starting to make Ireland smoke-free and Scotland smoke-free, and making pubs smoke-free in Ireland and Scotland. But you know, if you can achieve that, then all bets are off in terms of what's possible. And in both those cases, levels of public opposition in advance were quite high, and levels of public support, including in remote rural areas, were overwhelming very quickly. And I think, you know, we have got to think about how we frame those. At the Uruguay example and the questions about trade, if I'd had time to be coherent, I would have gone on to talk about those, because I think the most exciting thing that Bloomberg have done is support Uruguay in those disputes, and it's a recognition of how we need to get down and dirty at these really very difficult contexts and arenas where public health has traditionally found it very difficult to engage in. And Bloomberg and Gates being prepared to support Uruguay in those disputes was, you know, I think really kind of path-breaking. And you know, the discussions about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the strategy of getting a carve-out for tobacco was, I think, misplaced, but it was the beginnings of trying to think about more constructive discussions about how to promote policy coherence between trade and health. And I think I'd agree that there are aspects of that relationship that have been misunderstood in the past, partly through concerns about regulatory chill, etc. Again, I think, you know, the work that the McCabe Institute in Australia has done has been really exciting. Public health, international public health law needs to become central to public health research agenda. Broader questions around from Ethan and Bill. I guess this is where I personally begin to feel kind of uncomfortable in terms of gap between my personal preferences as a citizen and what I feel my obligations are as a professor of public health policy, which again, you know, I find one of the things I find quite frustrating about aspects of the conflict of interest discussion is the sense that, you know, sometimes it gets framed as if first transform global capitalism and then we can have a conversation about managing conflict of interest. And I understand the rationale for that intellectually is quite compelling, but politically is quite limited. And I guess we're kind of experiencing this in all sorts of ways. For example, the silence around commercial determinants of health. If we go back to the Uruguay meeting a year or so ago, there was a call for WHO to establish a commission on the commercial determinants of health. A commission was established, but by the time the report was published, commercial determinants of health didn't get a mention, and it's been kicked into the long grass because it's really kind of difficult and poses all sorts of questions that WHO and governments aren't really able or prepared to answer. So we have to find ways of taking this agenda forward in ways that don't frighten the horses too much. And you know, one of the things that we really shouldn't lose sight of from the tobacco control experience is that we were able to produce a convention that is essentially about regulating transnational corporations and presenting it as not anti-business and in ways that got the IMF and the World Bank on board. And that's a trick that we've got to be able to replicate and think about how we shape the discourse in these areas. So I think, you know, personally, I find the commercial determinants of health a really attractive framing, but politically it's a really difficult one to make progress on. I think we're maybe better off focusing on healthy commodity industries than commercial determinants more broadly. I think that there's various things that we need to think about in terms of how those things play out.
So I wanted to say a couple of quick things about conflict of interest. Then we're going to take one more round of questions. I'm going to ask people to be very short, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take 1 minute to give sort of closing thoughts, both in response to the question and the session as a whole. And I'm hoping the panelists can stay for at least a little while if people want to do more one-on-one discussions after this. So around conflicts of interest, I think it's urgently important for us to get this right, because for the public health enterprise to succeed in terms of promoting health, reducing health inequalities, we need the trust of the public. We can only achieve our goals with the trust of the public. And if we're not perceived as a credible source of evidence, if we're perceived as allied with business interests who are looking to advance their own agendas, if we're not able to distinguish between real science and fake science, then our whole enterprise is at risk. And so getting it right is particularly important. And of course it's complicated because corporations are very powerful entities and they're embedded in every one of our institutions. I'm certainly ashamed to say that my university, City University of New York, has a 10-year pouring rights contract with Pepsi-Cola. To my mind, that's a conflict between an educational institution that's trying to advance equity for low-income and working-class people in New York City to be supporting a corporation that's contributing so much to non-communicable diseases. We need to make that an issue. And I think as well as working on the global level around conflicts of interest, we need to bring it home. We need to be looking at our own academic institutions. We need to be looking at our professional associations, and there are a number of members of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics who have created groups to bring those issues forward in that professional organization, which has deep ties with the food industry. And by doing that, we will incorporate that perspective of understanding, looking for, and reducing conflicts of interest in every setting. And we'll bring up a generation of health professionals who have that embedded in their work. So I think that's important for us to be taking that very seriously. So we'll take 4 more questions, try and keep them brief, and then we'll have brief answers. And I'd suggest that we have new people if we can, or at least new people first.
Hi, Lucy Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of 1,000 Days Work on Nutrition for mothers and young children. Was involved in the World Health Assembly breastfeeding resolution controversy, which led to intense public debate here in the United States about the Trump administration's role in that. And so I'm looking at you, Paula, because of that slide that you showed that you sort of learned in that business school course around the intense public debate is a risk for companies, a potential regulatory risk. And I would love to hear from all the panelists in terms of how we can be doing more to encourage and seed that intense public debate around corporate practices and public health. Thank you.
It was the Bloomberg Foundation you put up on your slide, healthy school lunches. And I was just wanting to hear about the work that you're doing in that area and what's going on. I've always, school lunches are bad because there's no profit in, healthy school lunches. So how can we change that and fix that?
Yeah, it's Bill Jeffrey from the Center for Health Sciences and Law. Just as a follow-up, when this whole UN process started in 2011, a large number of groups signed onto this joint statement calling for the kind of transparency that you were talking about, Paula, that the World Health Organization and the UN shouldn't put all of NGOs into the same box because there are public interest NGOs and then there are NGOs that basically represent stakeholder groups. And there's lots of things in between. And we had hoped that that joint statement would put pressure on the United Nations to improve the conflict of interest text in subsequent political declarations. To my mind, it's gotten weaker. And the organization that now purports to represent civil society, which I think is what you were referring to in your slightly oblique comments earlier, the NCD Alliance was founded with $1 million grant from the world's largest medical technology company and is sustained with a lot of funding every year from the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. That's the kind of thing I think that they should be declaring every time they give a PowerPoint presentation or a public statement, but it's never happened. And I've tried to have conversations with them about that, but they say they don't want to talk about that. They just want to talk about their corporate charter or whatever. They don't want to talk about the funding.
And one more.
Good morning. I'm a registered dietitian, and I know exactly what you said. It's really true with the different corporations. Well, when former Mayor Bloomberg, implemented the city agency food standards, they were so good because people were eating like a Kaiser roll that had 500 milligrams of sodium, and they set a standard for how much sodium and fat and sugars will be in certain foods, but it only impacted some city agencies, very small, some programs that are funded. And I would like to see if we could, expand that to include even the school lunches, because they are operating differently. So I think a school like CUNY here and may be able to do that. I'm a product of CUNY schools as well. So I would love to see that, because it only impacts, I think, the elderly, the prisons, and the child care centers. Thank you.
So on the last question, the food standards do apply to the city school system. They don't apply to the city university. They apply to city-run agencies, and they are a big step forward. But let's ask for short statements from each of this. That will be our closing session, and then if you have more questions, chat after this is over.
So maybe in the interest of time, I'll just address the question that was put to me about healthy school lunches. This is a tough one, and one that there isn't as evolved an evidence base as we would like. And it really varies country to country, and we work largely outside the U.S. on this issue. And it is one that's active in all of the countries where we work, and perhaps Paula could comment on the innovative stuff they've done in Brazil around procurement. It's really, I think, a model. So it's in play, and every country is kind of at a different stage. So in many countries where we work, you can still find soda and soda advertising in schools. So that's a very obvious place to start, and then you build on that. The challenges with this is the incentives for what's procured in the schools are very complex. We're doing this work in South Africa and trying to map out what exactly that looks like and what are the incentives and where can we influence. The other thing is you can control what's sold and advertised on the school property, but as soon as you step off the property, there are vendors, that are selling all kinds of things. And in fact, our partners in Barbados have said often those vendors, they're trusted women from the community, and they'll look after the kids until their parents come and pick them up. And then the parents, to sort of thank them, will buy something. So it's complex. How do you deal with that? And then, and it's just the monitoring and enforcement is so decentralized in many of the places where we work, and that adds another layer of complexity. So I wish I had a really rock-solid example to give you to say, look, this works, this is a model. We don't, unfortunately. We're working on it, and I hope next time we have this conversation, we'll have some evidence that we can share with you. But it is an important population. You've got this captive audience, and many believe that that adults are sort of a lost cause, and if you're going to influence this, you've got to reach kids. I'm not sure we're quite that cynical, but completely appreciate that you've got to reach kids.
Just to reinforce quickly here the issue of the 4 areas of regulation that we have, and it includes school environments and other institutional environments. But of course, it's obviously important that you can move with the other 3 areas of policy, because that will make that much easier, including the other challenge. I mean, we need to talk about marketing restrictions. We need to talk about labeling and in ultra-processed foods, and we need to talk about taxation of harmful products. So when you do all the policies together, it makes so much easier to advance with that particular one, with the challenge that you have to implement it. That's why we talk about this package of policies, because they are mutually supportive. And then on the issue of conflict of interest, I think this is key to public health. And I think we have a lot to debate about it, and I think it's good that we have tensions in terms of different voices and then different in a spectrum. That's the beauty of coalitions as well, because you can have different voices playing different roles, and I think that's a major key issue, and definitely we need to discuss that. And I think the more you debate about an issue, the better. And honestly, even though the final text of the declaration is not as we would like it to be, and we are saying that as civil society organizations from the different broad spectrum of different civil society organizations, at the same time, I think there is a lot more discussion about it than it was before, back in 2011, because back then it was just a plain like, oh, public-private partnerships will solve the problem. Now at least we have some building momentum for criticism that will not solve the problem by itself. So we need to be more critical about it, and we need to debate that. So I'm always in favor, even when you are like, I'm always in favor of debating the issue. That's the best way to get it more mature and to get through it, and then to find solutions that are feasible solutions in the opportunities, the political opportunities that you have, like drawing back to Jeff, either we change the system upside down overnight, which I don't see it happen anywhere in the world, and it never really had happened, or you have to find how can you navigate in that system to get some like better global public health measures. And I agree with you, Bill, that I don't think we're going in the right direction. That was my point. I think the world is going in the wrong direction overall, and it's more like the strategy, how do we make it stop, or how do we put some limits to what's happening out there? I think that's the issue.
So just on the schools bit, one other thought. You may want to look at what they've done in Chile. So I mentioned they've got this really innovative front of package warning label system. It's also tied to marketing restrictions. So if your product carries a warning, you can't market it on TV. And you can't even use the package to market. So it's really interesting. If you look at Frosted Flakes, for example, before and after, there's no Tony the Tiger or any of that stuff that's appealing to kids on the package. And further, that's connected to their tax. So, you know, things that the same nutrition criteria apply, and also with school procurement. So it's a really good example of coherence across all these different areas. And then I just realized I didn't make a closing remark, and I want to make one really, really quickly. I think our perspective at Bloomberg is we've just got to get on with it. I think we can sit here and debate, partnerships and what are acceptable partnerships, if any, what are not, and so on and so on. And there's a place for that, and glad people are doing it. But I think we just also, as Paula said, we've got to find those opportunities and start chipping away and start creating best practices and models. And I think in Mexico, they've done that around the sugary beverage tax. We've seen it catch on. And we, partners there learned a lot from that experience, which they've then shared with advocates around the world. We're seeing, South Africa, where we work, also passed a sugary beverage tax. There were a whole host of learnings that came from that. And so we really see our role as just, let's hit the ground running, let's be evidence-based, let's chip away at this and disseminate the lessons. Is it happening as quickly as we would like? No, but it is happening. And I think that's what keeps us going.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit overwhelmed by the range of things I'd like to say, but I'll keep it to two things. Comprehensiveness and coherence. Firstly, I apologize, I didn't respond to Bill's first point about the FCDC implementation slide. I presented, I think the FCDC is a remarkable success story and outlined with limitations. When I introduced this to my students, my punchline is, this must be a really easy treaty to ratify if so many countries are being able, and what does ratification mean? And there's still all sorts of work to do for this treaty to become really meaningful and for its potential to transform lives to be realised. But I think the key to that is, as Paula said, comprehensiveness. And I think it's really important that we avoid kind of tokenistic initiatives, and I agree with Nina about the importance of chipping away, but thinking about how things can fit together to have more fundamental changes is I think, are really important. And I guess, I think, given it is 7 years since 2011, very little has changed since. I'm not convinced the declaration now is any stronger than the one then. We've got to stop doing things that we know don't work, and we've got to be thinking in more coherent and ambitious ways. And the industry have had this message much more clearly. The first thing that Philip Morris did when they heard about the FCDC was to look at Nestle and how they responded to the infant formula report. If we look at industry coherence in lobbying around the Uruguay meeting last year, a simple, unified, single message: remove taxes, remove taxes, remove taxes. They succeeded in removing taxes. I'm not convinced. Of course, one of the wonders of civil society is its diversity, and you can't be trying to get a single or looking to impose uniformity. But lobbying around key movements like this, I think, needs to be more strategic and more coordinated. And I think groups like NCD are have a really important role.
Jeff, Paula, thank you so much. Wonderful discussion.